Good evening and welcome to one and all back to Harvard Hillel's online speaker series. This will be the final program for the academic year of 2023-24. And this evening, it is an honor to welcome and have with us Bret Stephens. First, I want to, before I introduce Bret, just extend some words of gratitude. This is part of the annual Reisman Forum for Politics and Policy that we host here at Harvard Hillel. And we are grateful to the Mandel and Madeline Berman Foundation, who sponsor our annual Reisman Forum in honor of the late Robert Reisman, who was so committed to Jewish life and thought at Harvard. Our guest this evening, Bret Stephens, is an opinion columnist for the New York Times and the founder and editor-in-chief of Sapir, a new quarterly devoted to issues of Jewish concern, where my dear old friend Phil Gretz, I think, is the managing editor. Bret has previously served as editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and as foreign affairs columnist of the Wall Street Journal, where he was also deputy editorial page editor. Raised in Mexico City and educated at the University of Chicago and the London School of Economics, he's the author of America in Retreat, New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder, which was published in 2014. And his awards and honors include the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Commentary. In 2022, the government of Russia banned him for life. Bret, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
It's good to be here, Danny.
I want to begin by asking you, you were really one of the louder voices sounding the alarm about rising anti-Semitism well before October 7th. How has October 7th and the month since changed your view of America as a home for American Jews?
I wasn't entirely surprised by what unfurled after October 7th, because I think these forces have been running underground for many years. But even having sort of anticipated a lot of it, it still feels like very profound shock. And I will tell you a story that captures the way I feel. I can't remember the date now, but there is a now famous footage of a Jewish student at Harvard. I guess it's on the Yard, being surrounded and hounded by anti-Israel protesters. And it happened that I was watching that footage with my elderly mother, who was born in Nazi-occupied Europe and survived the war thanks to the kindness of an Italian family. And my mother turned to me and she said, "Bret, I was born in hiding, and I don't want to die in hiding." And that exchange with her, that comment, has had a really enduring impact. It makes me wonder whether we are at the beginning of a 50-year cycle that's going to unfurl much in the way that Europe unfurled over close to 50 years between the Dreyfus Affair and the Shoah. It was the witnessing of the Dreyfus Affair that convinced Herzl, of course, that the Jews had no future in Europe. And I sometimes wonder whether what October 7th and its aftermath have offered is something similar, a suggestion, a hint that our future in the United States as a Jewish community is also in jeopardy.
And I'm curious, sort of on a personal level, how has this affected you, your own sense of Jewish identity, Jewish self since October 7th?
No, it hasn't changed. I mean, I had a kind of a very clear sense of my identity and self for a very long time, in part because of my mother's experiences as a child. But it certainly changed the urgency with which I approached this. I mean, I sometimes joke with my editor at the New York Times that I can't wait to have an opportunity not to write in one way or another about what's happening in Israel. I think I've written north of 30 or 40 columns on the subject, and I do feel, particularly because I think I'm a dissenting voice in some of the circles I inhabit, more of a responsibility to speak up and do what I can to articulate and provide language for people who are like-minded but struggle to find the language. I feel that in a way I've become a voice for those people. One reader uh, stopped me on the street and said to me something like, "You're my weekly reminder that I'm not going insane." So I thought, well, if I'm doing that, I must be doing. She seemed like a nice lady, so I hope I'm doing something right.
Hmm. You mentioned, I think one of the earlier instances is a Harvard Business School student who was accosted. Um, and I'm curious what you make of what's happening on college campuses in general, which we go back to immediately following October 7th, and also more recently, the protests turning into encampments. And what do you think of the long-term implications of what we're seeing on college campuses?
Well, I think you have to, every campus is unique, number one. And number two, I think it's notable that you never hear of an encampment at, say, the University of Nebraska, Purdue. Most American students go to campuses where this is the protest movement is alien to their experience. I think this is a phenomenon to a large extent of um, elite, maybe I should put that in quotation marks, elite universities. I also think you have to distinguish between a kind of a very small, not very small, but a minority of students who are the hardcore, the people who do participate in the encampments, who protested graduation, commencement ceremonies, and a penumbra, if you will, of students who are either quietly supportive or at least indifferent. And I am honestly more worried about that penumbra than I am about the hardcore. On any campus, in any generation, you would find a small group of students who were really, zealots or dedicated to, Maoism or whatever the cause might have been in previous generations. But imagine, I mean, I've been thinking about this. Let's imagine the following scenario. A small group of super right-wing Harvard students began issuing white supremacist manifestos, Charlottesville style uh, bigotry and demagogy. Would the vast majority of Harvard students kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's them, but let's get on with it? Or no, I doubt that very much. I think the presence of this hypothetical right-wing group on campus would absolutely galvanize the overwhelming majority of students against them. And I don't see that happening in any way here. And so there's a quality of implied consent or going along, or at least feeling like what these students who are calling for the destruction of Israel, what they're doing is within the Overton window of acceptability. And that worries me. And it also worries me, I have to say, and I know I don't want to speak in overbroad generalizations, but my sense is that the extreme of the protesters who are in the encampments, who are more of an extreme, have the support of a frighteningly large number. I don't know if it's a minority, plurality, I'm not sure, but a stunning number of professors. It should be the job of professors to challenge the kind of political simplicities of their more radical students. And these professors, I think, seem to see it as their job to encourage them. I know this is more of a phenomenon at Columbia because I've seen, the letters that Columbia faculty have signed, the censure vote against President Shafiq there. So I'm not quite sure where things stand at Harvard, but I think too many professors in elite academia are not fulfilling their intellectual responsibility of trying to challenge or at least complexify the views of their most radical students. Instead, they're just undergirding them.
And I'm curious, when you talk about the distinction between an elite university and a place like University of Nebraska, do you think that Overton window has shifted there also? That maybe if they don't have that kind of hardcore or the most vocal, but are you concerned with what in theory people, students in schools like that or faculty in schools like that, how they would respond were they confronted with a protest like this or a pro-Palestinian movement that we've seen, and whether or not they would also be complacent?
The answer is I don't know, and I think it's a bit of a shame that I don't know. I did have a good experience. I was invited to speak at a place called Grand Mesa University, which is in Grand Junction, Colorado, on the western slope of the Rockies, closer to Utah than to Denver. And I had a fantastic experience with the faculty and the students who were curious, interested, knowledgeable, a lot of vets among them. So a lot of people who had actually been to the Middle East. And so, but that is kind of my, that's the extent of my knowledge of it. And I'm not almost, I am embarrassed that I spend so much time thinking about what's happening at the sorts of campuses I attended or my children attend, that I'm not paying enough attention to where most Americans send their kids to college. But I do worry, and this is, I'd love more information, but I do worry that the behavior of, or the visible behavior of professors and students at Harvard are doing vast damage to the perception among the American public of the value of higher education. And you've seen that. In fact, there's some evidence to this effect. Gallup, which polls confidence in American institutions, saw a precipitous decline in confidence in higher education, and that was a poll taken before October 7th. One of the reasons America was able to lead the way it did after World War II is that our great universities produced not just great scholarship and great alumni, but they produced a kind of a climate of respect for the life of the mind. And I think they are forfeiting that respect by the way in which things have unfurled in the last 8 or 9 months.
And do you have any sort of theories of how that could be changed and shifted and return us to that kind of place where higher education was doing the job that it sounds like you think it should be doing?
I think it's going to be a really hard task because tenure and the entire system through which academic distinctions are awarded, and I mean by that, named university chairs and all that stuff, administrative seats, university presidencies. I think they are the product of a system which has become very narrow-minded, politically censorious, ideologically monolithic, and that has prized identity over intellectual excellence. And I think that the grip that DEI has taken in many universities and the bureaucracies that enforce its mandates has been damaging. You're now seeing some of it being, steps being taken away from it, like the end of the mandatory DEI statements. But you have a whole generation of academics who came up with this frame of mind, and that's not easily undone. And I think here's another worry I have, Danny. Every year, lots of bright kids go to the Harvards and Yales of America. And it used to be that some percentage of those bright kids would have aspirations to become university professors. I wonder whether university PhD programs are now capturing the smartest and most interesting kids, or whether they're all heading to, whatever, the Goldman Sachs's of the world, because they can see that the intellectual climate in the kind of PhD programs they might want to pursue is stifling, looks down on dissenting views, and so on. And so they just sort of take their intellect and their energy and their creativity elsewhere. And it's a sort of a second, if not a third tier of students who wind up pursuing academic careers. Again, that's a hypothesis, and I'm probably insulting a great many people here, but I think that's one of the reasons you asked me on this Zoom call.
To say the things that I'm afraid to say myself?
Well, listen, I mean,
Not really.
later on there'll be time for questions and answers, and people should ask challenging questions. And look, I don't pretend to be an expert in academia. This is a view from the outside.
So on that, I think I want to shift a little bit to talk about, global affairs and politics. Let's just begin. A lot of talk of what a day after would look like in Gaza. And so what do you view as being the best day after plan, and kind of where should we ultimately be headed, and what's the roadmap to get there?
Well, the first thing is that I think it would help if the government of Israel had a declaratory policy that went somehow as follows. We want a Palestinian state if it looks like the United Arab Emirates, and we don't want a Palestinian state if it looks like Yemen. Which is to say, what matters to an Israeli government isn't the fact of a Palestinian state, it's the character and the nature and the purpose of a Palestinian state. A Palestinian state that looks like Gaza has looked over the past 17 or so years is a non-starter. It's a non-starter for most Israelis, and it's rightly a non-starter because nobody wants to midwife into existence a state that's merely dedicated to the destruction of its neighbors. Neighbors, plural, by the way, not just Israel. But at the same time, the purpose of Zionism ultimately was Jewish self-rule. And Jewish self-rule means others don't rule over us as Jews, but we Jews don't rule over others, at least those others who don't want to be ruled by us. And so what has happened since 1967, for reasons that I think are ultimately understandable and tragic, not unintelligible and gratuitous, but tragic. But what has happened since 1967 has taken Zionism away from its best purposes, which is Jewish self-rule, right? Because Israel's neighbors intended to annihilate it in 1967, Israel wound up in the possession of territory and the occupation of people it didn't want to rule over. And then, what followed was 60 or so years of tragedy. But it matters. It's a little bit like saying, Danny, you have cancer. I'm sorry to tell you this. And it's in your liver, so we're going to just remove your liver, right? Of course, you would not for a second stand for, even if you accepted the diagnosis, as difficult as it is, you wouldn't stand for the purported cure. And so Israel and its well-wishers have to make sure that the cure isn't worse than the disease, that the creation of a Palestinian state, which is supposed to be a cure, doesn't simply create a terrorist statelet that looks like Gaza did on the eve of October 7th and that is dedicated to Israel's destruction. So step one is that declaratory policy. Then step two is trying to enlist the international community to help make that happen. Both Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis, the reasonably moderate Arab states, and reasonably again in quotation marks, have an interest in making sure that Hamas does not return to power in Gaza, because Hamas is an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, which threatens the regime in Egypt, but it's also an arm of Iranian power, which threatens all of the moderate Arab states. So they should understand that they don't want that to happen. So a pan-Arab police force or security force that creates conditions of basic security and doesn't have the taint of being Israeli or even part of the Palestinian Authority, I think would be an important second step. Thirdly, if Norway, Spain, Ireland, other countries want to recognize a Palestinian state, I say great, absolutely, let them do it, and then let them put their money where their mouth is. So I expect $15 billion from Spain, $15 billion from Ireland, and $30 billion of Norway, because they have all that dirty wealth from oil, to go into reconstruction of Gaza and genuine reconstruction, not simply money piled in so it can go into building tunnels. And then let's try to move the Palestinian people in a direction that says, we want a state that's worthy of our best aspirations and that isn't simply going to be dedicated to endless war and conflict with our neighbors.
And you think that a pan-Arab police force is something that these countries would be prepared to get behind, to actually enforce?
Well, I mean, it all depends on the incentives they have, right? And one of the reasons why I think it's important for Israel to really meaningfully destroy Hamas is that it eases the way for those states to put forces in that aren't going to simply come under fire from Palestinian militants or guerrillas. Again, diplomacy is required to persuade these states that they have a real strategic interest in a future for Gaza that looks better than its past did. And I don't just mean the last 8 months, I mean, again, the last 17 or so years. And beyond that, inducements, what can the United States do to persuade them? For example, Egypt is mired in debt. Could we forgive some of that debt in exchange for assistance on security? I think there's a deal to be had.
You mentioned Iran and the role that they play. I'm curious, how you're thinking about Iran, and both Israel's policy towards it and the United States' policy towards Iran has shifted since October 7th, and maybe also their response to the firing of missiles directly at Israel from Iranian soil.
Look, one of the, I think, misalignments in the conversation that we in the West, or in the United States at least, are having about this conflict and the conversation Israelis have, is that we think of this as the Gaza war, right? A geographically specific conflict pitting a larger state, Israel, against a smaller statelet Gaza. Israelis, I think, correctly understand that Gaza is just the most active military front in a 2 or 3 front war that ultimately traces back to Iran's longstanding intentions to wipe Israel off the map. And so what the fight they're waging against Hamas is just perhaps the preamble to a fight they're going to have with Hezbollah. In many ways, it's really happening now. And then the larger question, which is not just Iran, but Iran's apparently impending nuclearization. When you see it in that perspective, you understand why Israelis see this as an existential war, not just a kind of a war they can begin or end at any time they choose. If the question of Iran's nuclearization or potential nuclearization isn't addressed not just by Israel, but by its Western allies, by the United States, we're going to face a catastrophic scenario. And I'm talking we in the United States, a catastrophic scenario going forward, because I do think that a nuclear Iran is a unique global nightmare, given not just the regime's theology and its ambitions, but the different way in which I think its leaders think about calculations of risk and deterrence. And it's a genuinely frightening thing. And it worries me that most recently the Biden administration was trying to soften language about Iran's violations of its obligations under the NPT.
So what do you think the Biden administration, how should it change its course towards Iran?
The Biden administration will tell you, we haven't removed a single sanction that the Trump administration imposed. And that is true but deceptive. They haven't removed sanctions, but they've waived them. So, for example, at the end of the Trump administration or thereabouts, I'd have to go back and look at these figures. Iran was exporting no more than something like 300,000 barrels of oil a day, which is a catastrophic number for an economy that's as energy dependent as Iran's is. It's now somewhere around 1.8 million. And one of the things that the Biden administration ought to be doing is putting teeth into the sanctions that already exist, because we've seen that the regime is, in fact, quite fragile. And it is at an inflection moment where the heir apparent just died in an apparent helicopter crash. And the incumbent supreme leader is probably, not long to live. And transitions in dictatorial regimes like Iran can be potentially explosive, particularly given the vast discontent that we witnessed just a year and a half ago following the killing of that woman and the protest over hijab.
Thank you. I want to sort of shift a little bit more towards sort of where we situate ourselves today in American politics. And in a recent Sapir interview that you conducted with Congressman Richie Torres, the subtitle was "Israel's once robust set of friendships on the progressive left has been stripped back. Is pro-Israel Congressman Richie Torres the past or the future?" So I'm curious, what would be your answer to that question? Is he past or the future?
I don't know the answer. I mean, the easy answer is he's the past. But then you look at someone like John Fetterman, whose progressive bona fides were strong, and he gets it. And by the way, not at the expense of his progressivism, but because of it. Because look, Israel, like any other country, has many warts. But if you're LGBTQ, if you are a woman, if you believe in freedom of the press, if you believe in any progressive value, where would you rather be, Tel Aviv or Ramallah? Anyone who's intellectually honest should answer that question. And don't tell me, oh, it's pinkwashing. It is a reality, okay? It is a reality that Israel, for all of its flaws, does more to champion the values progressives claim as their own than any other state in the region. I do not understand slogans like Queers for Palestine, which you see sometimes at pro-Palestinian marches. My friend Jamie Kirchick said, it's the equivalent of a slogan that says, blacks for the KKK. It's a nonsensical slogan to be for a state where it is the norm for gays and lesbians not only to be mistreated, but frequently to be murdered. One of the most homophobic places in the world. And so I hope that some critical mass of progressives can say, by the way, we criticize Israeli policy. We don't like Netanyahu. We don't like the conduct of the war. That's all fine and good. But on the basic question of with whom we stand, you have to stand with Israel, right? Because those are your values. I better understand hardcore right-wing Republicans making a kind of realpolitik Kissingerian case that it's wrong to stand with Israel because, after all, there are many more Islamic states than there are Jewish ones, and it better suits the American national interest to stand with those Islamic states. That was George Marshall's argument against recognition of Israel in 1948. I get that. I just don't get the progressive argument against Israel. It seems to me to be a kind of intellectually vapid and hypocritical.
So where do you think that comes from? Meaning, why are people who, on the one
That's
hand,
an,
are progressive or not
that's
like
an
Fetterman?
interesting intellectual question, and I think it's because there is this and this is really something that you need a really great intellectual historian to unpack. I would say someone like Susie Linfield at NYU is a good source. Um, there, just like equality and equity are words that sound similar, but often mean radically different things. Liberty and liberation are words that again sound similar, but can often mean different things. Liberty essentially means a constitutional or political order in which the freedom of the individual is the sort of centerpiece ideal of the state, right? Or of the regime. If you, I'm using the word regime in a kind of Straussian sense here, but this is Harvard, so you know what I'm talking about. Liberation simply means a break with whatever came before. And so you can have a liberation movement that claims to espouse, I don't know, the rights of all or whatever, but is merely just kind of anti-bourgeois. And so Maoism was a form of liberation, right? The Khmer Rouge that people like Noam Chomsky were supporting back in the 1970s promised liberation. And of course, they ended up as totalitarian regimes. And I think there is a kind of an idea that Palestinian politics is part of a politics of liberation, irrespective of the fact that Palestine as an actual polity, so far as we've seen, is a kleptocracy or a theocracy. It doesn't promise liberty, and so, but that, look, this touches on a kind of a deeper mystery, which is the left's longstanding affinity with regimes that are egalitarian in theory and totalitarian in practice.
So, assuming that some of the progressives have their way, I'm thinking a bit about something that you wrote in the Times on May 9th. Israeli doubts about Americans' reliability could have unintended consequences harmful to U.S. interests, Israel turning toward Beijing or Moscow. That's the quote. So some critics of America's support for Israel don't seem to view it as a strategic asset. So I'm curious, what are the most important ways Israel is a strategic asset for the U.S.? And if that alliance begins to wane or if American support diminishes, what do you think are the biggest potential consequences for the United States?
Well, I do think it's a strategic asset for the United States. I think it has always been one, and you can point to ways that are um, essentially, tactical, if you will, by which Israel has proved its worth as an ally. And then you can look at a broader picture. I mean, in 1956, it was the Mossad that obtained Khrushchev's secret speech. I'm sure someone listening to this understands how important that was as an intelligence coup back in the 1950s. In 1980s, it was Israeli F-15s that proved their superiority against Syrian MiG jets. I mean, again, underscoring the importance of the military and intelligence relationship. But strategically, on a broader plane, look, tomorrow, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt could be assassinated, and you could have a Muslim Brotherhood, the resumption of a Muslim Brotherhood regime. And Egypt, a nominal American ally since the days of Sadat, so going back more than 50 years, or at least 50 years, would go back into the enemy's column very quickly. If Bibi Netanyahu were to, fly away or whatever, disappear from the scene tomorrow, there is no conceivable Israeli government that wouldn't be pro-Israel, that wouldn't be pro-American. So right then and there, you have a situation in Israel where the government is almost always going to be pro-American unless we take steps of our own to shove it out of the way, to tell them that we don't consider them an ally. The second aspect is this. One of the ways in which America's foreign policy tends to succeed is when we allow our interests to follow our values and to or rather our values to define our interests rather than our interests to define our values. So what do I mean by that? The Roman Empire, its interest was conquest. And so what were its values? Loyalty, honor, courage, martial values, military values. The United States, when we've been at our best, we have insisted that our values matter most. So we came under President Truman to the defense of this embattled little enclave that everyone thought was indefensible in 1948, supported it against totalitarian or authoritarian enemies. And in the end, it paid tremendous dividends. I'm talking about West Berlin, okay? Truman did not have to defend West Berlin. He did so with this airlift. And then 40 years later, the Cold War ended without a shot being fired and a life being lost because East Germans could just look over the wall and say, that's better than what we've got. So by allowing our values to define our interests, we actually fulfilled our most important interest, which was beating the Soviets in the Cold War. I think similarly, people will say that Truman's recognition of a Jewish state was a matter of values defining interests, not the other way around. And now we have a pillar of Western support, to say nothing of a highly technological, thriving, flourishing state that produces nearly as much AI and other stuff that we like as the United States does. And that's a good thing. It's a particularly good thing in an era when you have a kind of a new axis of totalitarian or quasi-totalitarian states defined by Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang. And we need all the allies we can get. So whether it's Ukraine or Taiwan or Lithuania, Estonia, and Israel, we should cherish those allies and we should protect them against totalitarian or fanatical adversaries.
So you're talking about our interests following our values. It reminds me a bit of a piece that you wrote about some of the challenges that you think Europe is facing, one of which is a demographic question. But in that piece in the Times, what struck me most was this general sense of ideological commitments aren't really worth fighting for. The people in Europe don't have a sense that these are things that are so deeply important that they need to be fought for. And I'm curious if you can describe a little bit of what underlies that phenomenon in Europe, and if you think the same is also true here in the US.
Well, I think in Europe, look, again, Europe is a big place, and Poland or Estonia have very different attitudes than, say, I don't know, Spain or Portugal, including their attitudes about their willingness to fight to defend their hard-won freedoms. But over the past 35 years, Europe acted as if it had no conceivable enemy, and that it could afford to indulge a foreign policy that rested entirely on soft power and didn't have any real hard power connected to it. I mean, Europe's militaries, with almost no exceptions, are in a totally shambolic state. Right up until the invasion of Ukraine, Germany was busily trying to pay the Russians off by buying their natural gas. And Europe has this other problem, which is a deeper one, which is that last year or the year before, 3.9 million people were born in Europe, but more than 5 million people died. When you don't have children, you tend to live more for the present than you do for the future. And a continent that is increasingly childless may not want to make the sacrifices that are required for succeeding generations to thrive in conditions of political freedom. That's certainly not true in Israel, because Israel has a robust demography, and not just among the ultra Orthodox, but across the country. I don't know how true it is in the United States, and I think that's a fundamental political question, which is, to what extent is the present generation prepared to make political choices that are really not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of some future generation? And there's a lot of evidence here in the United States that we're not prepared to make those choices, that we are, in fact, living much too much for the present. And that's a real issue.
Well, Brett, thank you so much for taking my questions. We're going to start heading now to audience Q&A. If you do have a question, you can type it into the Q&A icon down below. Do so by name, not anonymously. And if you have time for your question, we'll promote you to turn on your audio and video and ask your question directly. So we're going to begin with Harvard Business School alum, Doug Whale. Doug, thank you so much for joining us. You can go ahead and ask your question directly.
In a recent column, you suggested that the Ukraine and Gaza wars are existential wars. If so, why should the United States prohibit Israel and Ukraine from using all the weapons they can in order to defeat the Gazans and the Russians?
Well, I think that certainly the policy of the Biden administration, and I've criticized it, of limiting not just the nature of the weapons it's providing the Ukrainians, but the range or the use of those weapons, I think has been a terrible mistake, born of early overconfidence about the outcome of the war. And now we're all paying the price for that mistake. I think the same is true with respect to providing Israel with some of the munitions that it needs. Now, there was a question recently, this is in the last month or so, about a potential embargo by the United States on certain kinds of bombs for Israel. But Israel doesn't need those bombs against Gaza. It needs them in the event of a war with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, which is a much more entrenched and ferocious adversary. So I have publicly and repeatedly criticized the Biden administration for the kind of somewhat half-hearted support, if not very half-hearted support, that it's provided to allies. You're going to support an ally, support him to the hilt. It sends a very powerful message to our joint or our common adversaries. And I think that Biden doesn't seem to have a concept of victory, and that's a real problem.
Doug, thank you for joining and for your question. We'll turn now to Shelley Hebert from, actually, she's very involved at Stanford there in their Jewish Alumni Association. Shelley, it's good to see you again. Thanks for joining, and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. I'd like to ask if our speaker could comment on the congressional hearings on anti-Semitism on college campuses, and whether you think that this is actually going to change behavior of university leaders and trustees, or is it primarily political theater? And also, secondly, is the threat of loss of federal funding through violations of the civil rights, Title VI, is that a real threat, or is that just, again, sort of theatrics? Thank you.
Well, the answer to your second question, Shelley, is I don't know. We'll find out. A lot rests on what happens in November. Look, I have to say the civil libertarian in me doesn't like the sight of these university presidents being hauled before congressional committees and asked, what about this professor? What about the other professor? That's what happened with Minouche Shafik at Columbia, where she all but announced she was going to fire or not renew the contract of this or that professor. It had a kind of a McCarthyite quality that sat ill with me. On the other hand, I don't think I can deny the fact that that initial hearing with Presidents Gay and McGill and the president of MIT, whose name escapes me, um, uh, weren't very useful in not only calling attention to what was happening, but also exposing the double standards by which they were operating. And the double standard was in effect that they were against free speech when it came to hateful comments about many minorities, but they were for free speech when it came to hateful comments about Jews. And that was that moment of Elise Stefanik's questioning of Claudine Gay did a lot of good. So I have to concede that. But my general view is I don't think it's the role of government to act like that in general. I mean, and I would say this, by the way, about Bernie Sanders hauling CEOs in front of him to lecture them about their ill-gotten gains or whatever. I generally think it's an ugly face of government.
Shelley, thanks so much for joining. We'll turn now to Harvard alumna Nadine Gibson. Nadine, it's great to see you here. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Bret Stephens. I love reading your columns. Always edifies me. My question is, when you set out the schema you said earlier in this talk about what a post-Gaza situation could look like, I'm concerned that, and I want your opinion about whether have the Israeli public themselves been so traumatized by what has happened that there isn't really support in Israel anymore, in a meaningful way, to have something like the schema you set out post the Gaza war, if and when that ends. And I think on the other side too, when the Palestinians, given all the destruction and trauma that they've endured as the war has ground on, is there really not much support among the Palestinian public anymore for a demilitarized Palestinian state that could really coexist peacefully with Israel, if that were even possible, if all these other Gulf states were willing to put in the money, and if somehow diplomatically it could come together. I mean, how has the trauma of both peoples impacted your ability to have the kind of solution you are proposing?
It's a good question, Nadine, but I think at the moment it's somewhat unanswerable, in part because I think you have two populations that really don't know their own mind. If you say to Israelis, I mean, if you were to ask, the Shlomi, the Israeli grocer, I'm just, imagining a kind of, the average guy in Israel, would you do anything to get the hostages back? He would say yes. And if you were to say, would you do anything to destroy Hamas for good? He'd say yes. And if you were to say, but what if these two goals are foundationally incompatible, he would say, he'd shrug his shoulders and say, yeah, I don't know. So what the missing, what's missing there is leadership. And I'm sorry to say, but in Israel right now, you had a bad leader to begin with, and I think of a confounding public sphere at the moment. With respect to the Palestinians, I think this is even more difficult because public opinion in totalitarian societies, where saying what you think runs, ruinous personal risks, means not only that people are afraid to speak, but often that they don't really know what to think, right? And people who have emerged from totalitarian societies will often tell you that this is part of the doublethink that kind of creeps into your very mind and soul when fear and obedience and these kinds of things are all kind of mixed into your internal rhythm of how you think about politics. So I think among Palestinians is there tremendous hatred for Israel for the bombardments in Gaza? Yes. Is there tremendous hatred for Hamas for hiding hostages among civilians and exposing them to the kinds of terrors to which they've been exposed? Yes. How could you sort that out? You have to at some level, end the conditions of fear under which they live. And I don't just mean the bombing, I mean also the fear of Hamas and its secret police and its reprisals and all the apparatus of sort of Stasi-like apparatus that has defined Sinwar's regime. So all of that's a long way of saying I don't think it's possible to answer your questions.
Do you see any leaders who could do what you say needs to be done? You say it takes leadership. Are there any leaders on either side that could do this?
Yeah, I do. I do. Look, in Israel, I think almost any leader who isn't Bibi would be an improvement in my view. Gallant, who has credibility on the right, but is, I think, a much more sober-minded and patriotic and less unscrupulous politician would be someone. I see Naftali Bennett emerging once again. I think Lapid is. I mean, he's not a wartime leader. He doesn't have the depth of experience. But I mean, I can think of a half dozen Israelis off the top of my head who are plausible candidates who would do a better job than the current incumbent.
And Palestinians?
It's very hard to say because I'll never forget when I was editor of the Jerusalem Post, I got to know the ambassador of the Czech Republic. And what had he been doing during the communist era? He was a window washer, right? So the people who emerge after totalitarian societies are not people who are sort of waiting in the wings. They don't necessarily have political ranks. So it'll be the proverbial Palestinian window washer who steps forward. I don't think anyone that I could think of who has a position of power, either in Fatah, certainly not in Hamas, or among Palestinian intellectuals, could do it. I mean, obviously there's Salam Fayyad and people like that, but Fayyad has a very difficult relationship with Palestinian centers of power.
Thank you.
Nadine, always wonderful to see you. Thank you.
Yes.
We'll turn now to Michael Holloway. Michael's got a good question. Thanks for joining us. And just need to unmute yourself, Michael.
You're muted. You're still muted.
Sorry. Mr. Stephens, while we have you here, I'm sure a lot of us would like to hear your insights about the apparent bias in the New York Times towards information that comes from Hamas, pictures, statistics, statements, and the apparent ignoring of things like Israeli briefings. Do you have any insight you can give to us about that?
I have a standard issue to this question, a standard answer to this question. And that is the New York Times is the most important newspaper in the world, and I'm glad I'm a part of it.
Yeah. Well, is this a standard journalistic practice? Because the New York Times isn't alone in this. It seems to be something serious journalists are doing.
To repeat, the New York Times is the most important newspaper in the world, and I'm glad I'm a part of it. And I speak for myself.
Great. Thank you, Bret. Michael, thanks for your question. We'll turn to Eric Flieger from a doctor here in the Boston area. Eric, it's nice to see you. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Nice to see you, and thank you again. I read your columns all the time. So I want to flip the question a little bit. I'm sure there are many of us who have friends who are from the Middle East, who are currently going through their own feelings of devastation, anger, hurt, and I find myself really quite torn as to how to have conversations. I don't think that the standard statements which I often hear is these people invited Hamas in, they voted them in, and therefore they have to live with what they're dealing with, is acceptable. And I'm looking for ways to have a better conversation.
I think it's extremely difficult, to be perfectly blunt. This has been a uniquely polarizing event, and polarizing in a way that calls into question not just people's political positions, but in a sense their moral compass as well. And I think that's a shame, because I'm a great believer in having conversations across differences. But the few conversations I've seen that don't dissolve into acrimony tend to dissolve into platitudes. You know, we're all for our common humanity. We all want, you know, the innocent to be spared. But beyond that, it's difficult to have productive conversations. You know, if I had an opportunity to speak to people on the other side of it in person, and with some assurance that they would at least listen and think about what I'm saying, maybe they do, I would say to them, no matter what you think about the way in which Israel is conducting the war, you cannot possibly want to live in a world in which Hamas wins. You would not wish that on Palestinians, you would not wish that on Israelis, and you would not wish that on the world. And you would especially not wish it on Palestinians, because surely Palestinians deserve better than to live under the thumb of a theocratic despotism that treats its own civilian population as disposable. Notice that when Russian missiles attacks Ukrainian cities like Kyiv, the Ukrainian officials send women and children underground to their metro to be safe. When Israeli bombs fall on Gaza, it's Hamas that goes to its own metro, so to speak, its own underground network of tunnels, and leaves the women and children to fend for themselves. When convoys of food come into Gaza, it's Hamas that has first dibs on the food, leaving civilians to try to fight it out for themselves among criminal gangs. So surely, no matter what you think about Israeli policy or Palestinian state, you would not want Hamas to rule that state any more than even the most ardent anti-Vietnam War protesters would have wanted, if they knew what the Khmer Rouge was about, to want the Khmer Rouge to win after the collapse of the regime in 1975. I don't like calling those protesters I see in encampments, I don't like calling them pro-Palestinian. They're anti-Israel. They think they're pro-Palestinian, but they're not. And there's a way to be pro-Palestinian, and there's a way to want a better future for the Palestinians and an independent Palestinian state that doesn't involve fellow traveling with Hamas and wishing the destruction of the Jewish state.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the protesters. I'm talking about our friends, and that all of us have, who are this. And it's interesting in the analogy you used. Unfortunately, Israel is the one dropping the bombs at this point, as opposed to Russia in that analogy. But I hear you. It is a hard conversation.
Yeah, I get it, but Israel's dropping the bombs because more than 12,000 rockets, if not more, have been fired at Israel. And we don't talk about that because Israel developed systems to protect its civilians against indiscriminate rocket fire, whereas the Hamas fires indiscriminately. I mean, it's fundamentally different.
Eric, thank you for joining us. That'll be the last question for this evening and for this academic year. Thank you all so much for joining us. Our community now reaches over 12,000 registrations or live views we've had, and our videos we have almost 900 here today, are available on YouTube, on the Harvard Hill YouTube channel. So please go there and you can check out the 20 or so videos and interviews we've had so far this year. Bret, I want to thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and all that you've written and shared in the New York Times, in Sapir. If you haven't seen Sapir, please go ahead and check out that journal. And thank you so much for your wonderful answers tonight. Mine, as well as those of Eric and of our audience. We're very grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to wish everyone a wonderful evening and a wonderful summer, and join us back here next academic year. We'll be getting in the fall again, so you should be receiving emails from us. But until then, I wish everyone the best.